chapter 26 is where we are beginning. We continue to be in this overall section where Ezekiel is going to declare prophecies against other nations. Remember, chronologically, we're kind of after the fall of Jerusalem. The siege has already happened. They've already fallen. So there's no point in talking to Israel anymore, warning them of the siege because it's there. The fall is imminent. It is all happening at this time. So because God has addressed the house of Israel, remember, judgment starts in the house of God. It starts at the top and works its way down. Because it has already fallen upon them, now he is turning his attention to those nations who have set their hearts against Israel. And the first one that we're going to look at today is in a 3-chapter arc, chapters 26 through 28. 26 through 28 is a 3-chapter arc against the city of Tyre. Now, there's two things to mention as we get going here. One, this is a prophecy against the city of Tyre, with the end result being that the city will be totally gone. That is different from the people of the region. Because when we get to the New Testament, we're going to see references to Tyre and Sidon, not just if the gospel had come to those cities, but there's going to be aspects to the people. There's the people in the region who will continue. However, the city itself will no longer exist after Alexander the Great has gone through. Second, Ezekiel has more references to the city of Tyre than any other book of the Bible. It has the absolute most. And these 3 chapters have almost all the references to Tyre in the book of Ezekiel, except for one little one in chapter 29, and we'll talk about that one when we get there. But I say this so that we kind of understand and get our bearings as we get going. Verse 1 tells us that Ezekiel receives this prophecy in the 11th year of the exile, which we know as Bible students is the year that Jerusalem fell to Nebuchadnezzar. It had been under siege for 2 years at this point. It doesn't tell us what month, but because Tyre is celebrating over the fall of Jerusalem, we can assume that this is after the 4th month of the year, because Jerusalem falls in the 4th month of the 11th year of the exile. The 4th month of the 11th year of the exile, which for our purposes is neither here nor there, but just so we kind of have our time bearing. All right, verse 2 is where we really get going as God reveals that he knows that Tyre has rejoiced over the fall of Jerusalem and said to herself that since the gateway of the people have broken, Tyre will be filled. That once belonged to Jerusalem will now go to Tyre. Now here's what's going on. The reason that Israel, Judah, and Samaria, the northern and southern kingdoms, have always mattered to world history is because of their location. Not just because they were at the nexus of the junction of the 3 continents of Africa, Europe, and Asia, but because of the topography of the land. Now, one of the handouts that I handed out to you is this one, and it has the mountains, and it has the flat plains, and it has the Mediterranean Sea. If you kind of hold it up with the sea on your left, you'll have the north-south orientation to it. Now, here's why this matters. If you look at this, you'll see there's the Mediterranean Sea here in the blue. Then you have the mountains over here on the far east. In between the two of those is the flatland. This is the farmland of Israel. If you were coming out of Egypt and you wanted to go to the markets over in Babylon or in Persia or in Turkey or over to Europe, you had to go through this flat area. You couldn't go through the mountains. It would be too difficult. The sea is right there, but there's this flat land almost like a highway. And right there across from the flat land, if you look right in the middle, is the city of Jerusalem. It's nestled high in the mountains and in the hills. But because of its perfect location, it had the ability to force project over anybody who came by. If you didn't pay the toll, if you didn't pay the tax, you couldn't get your caravan through. And you would have to go along this coastline right next to Jerusalem all the way until you got to the valley of Megiddo, Armageddon, which lets you now go east and west to other areas and other markets. This is what made Jerusalem so important. Caravans had to have Jerusalem's permission in order to get by. And the reason why this matters is that if you didn't want to go by Jerusalem, you didn't want to do the land caravans, you only had one other option, the sea, the Mediterranean. And Tyre had the strongest navy in the ancient world. And if you wanted to get your goods from Egypt and Africa all the way up to Europe or vice versa, because those are the 3 great markets of the world at that time, You would either go by land and by Jerusalem or by sea and by Tyre. But the struggle with taking things by sea at that time, even though Tyre's navy was the most powerful, is that there were no massive container ships back then. So taking something by boat was restricted by the size of the boat that you could actually put things on. It was also more risky at times, especially during certain seasons of the Mediterranean when storms would sweep through. We'll read about this at the end of Acts. Because large portions of the year, especially the winter, was closed off to you sending anything by sea. Really, your safest bet and your most profitable bet was to send things by land by Jerusalem. But now Jerusalem has fallen. And what Tyre sees in their eyes are dollar signs. Because now that's no longer the way to go. The Babylonian army's there, and if you want to send your stuff back and forth to these different markets, guess what? We're the only game in town. You have to send your stuff by us. Therefore, Tyre rejoices when she hears about the fall of Jerusalem. No longer is the money going to flow to them. Now the money is going to flow to us. Therefore, verse 3, and that's a really big reason word here. Therefore, because of their joy over the fall of Jerusalem, the Lord God is against Tyre, and he will bring many nations against her. These nations, plural, multiple, would break down the walls of the city of Tyre, and God would devastate the city so completely that the nations will scrape off even the debris, even the dust from the city, and will transform the city into a bare, flat rock. And its only use from that time on will be to spread out nets to dry them before putting them away. Now, please note in verse 5 and verse 6, God points out that Tyre will be broken down in two sections. There is an island in verse 5. And we know that because it talks about nets being laid out in the midst of the sea. You don't dry your nets in the middle of the ocean. You have to have an island that's in the midst of the sea, and then you dry your nets on that. But then there is also a mainland, verse 6. Historically, we know how this prophecy will be completely fulfilled. The major conquests that lead to the destruction of Tyre comes in two ways. The first way begins in verse 7 and goes through verse 12. This is the campaign of Nebuchadnezzar leading the Babylonian army when they lay siege to the city of Tyre, starting in 586 BC. And for future reference, you may want to write next to verse 7, 586 to 573 BC. This is how perfectly our God fulfills his prophetic word. During that 13-year siege, Nebuchadnezzar surrounded the city of Tyre on the mainland. But progress was very slow. Tyre was a port city. Therefore, it could be resupplied by the sea. Usually, the way a siege worked is that you would starve the city. That's what they did with Jerusalem, 2 years, right? The famine was great on the inside. You would lose your strength, your will, your ability to fight. But Tyre didn't have that problem because, again, they had the best navy in the world. And even the Babylonian navy could not stop what they were doing. That's what great sailors they were. Still, this was Babylon. Tyre knew it was only a matter of time before Babylon won. So what they did was they moved the bulk of the people to an island that was a bit over a half mile from the shore. Now, if you take this other map you have, you see the island. The shore is off to the right of the piece of paper. Ignore that land bridge for just a moment because it's not there yet. It's about a half-mile distance. So you couldn't just swim your guys out there. It's not like you could run from the beach and run over to the next beach. You would still have to have a navy, and nobody was able to defeat the navy of Tyre. Over the course of 13 years, they slowly moved the buildings, the people, and especially the riches over to this island. And when Nebuchadnezzar broke through the walls, that's verse 9 and 10, he discovered that most of the people and most of the riches and most of the goods were moved to the island. That's why Ezekiel 29:18, God is going to say that the army of the Babylonians worked hard against Tyre, but they received no wages for the siege. Because when they finally broke down the walls, there were no riches. There were no wages for them. Tyre had moved the bulk of everything to the island. Now, Tyre will agree to become a vassal of Nebuchadnezzar after the mainland is taken. But Nebuchadnezzar was so angered by the results that we took the city and there's nothing to show for it, that he knocks down every single building on the mainland before he leaves. Now, all the mainland is covered in debris. They'll go and kind of rebuild. They'll kind of rebuild walls, but most of the buildings are still lying on the ground for a couple hundred years. And we see that anger and that knocking of everything down in verse 12. But there's something else to notice in verse 12. If you look in your English Translation Bible in verses 8 through 11, you'll see that God is talking about Nebuchadnezzar, a singular person specifically in all those verses, because he keeps saying he this, and he that. But look what happens in verse 12. The pronoun suddenly changes from he to they. He's talking about more people at this point. Different waves that are going to come. Because the beginning of verse 12 starts under the Babylonians, but it will be completed in 332 BC, and that is the map that's in front of you by Alexander the Great. Now, in 332 BC, and you may want to write that next to verse 12, in 332 BC, Alexander begins his siege of Tyre. Again, this is the importance of the area. It is the last major naval port in that area that is resisting the Greek advance. It's the last one that kind of gave the Persian Navy any power at all. He was determined to take it. So he goes and he begins his siege. And Alexander is far more effective, but he is especially far more impatient than Nebuchadnezzar. And after 7 months, he breaks down the walls of the mainland city. Again, the people of Tyre retreated to the island, but Alexander was brilliant, and so were his engineers. And so what they did is they built the half-mile-long causeway. That is this mole on the map. It is a land bridge that they build all the way out to the island so they can march their army right up to the city gates, attack it from the outside by their navy, which was weaker than the Tyre navy. But between their navy and their army, they were able to devastate the island, and they tore everything down. Now, this is how complete the prophecy of the Lord is. When people tell you, well, that's just a book, it's just a myth, it's just imagination, understand how completely God fulfilled this particular prophecy. In verse 4, it says they're going to scrape the debris, the dust from the city of Tyre. When Alexander was making the causeway, it's believed that his army took the dust from the ruins of Tyre that were there because of Nebuchadnezzar. And they took everything, and they used the rocks from that to make the land bridge, and they used even the dust to fill in the gaps between the stones and the rocks. So it would be a flat surface for them to go all the way to the island. So the old city was totally scraped clean at that time. By these two waves, God would silence the songs, the prideful mirth, verse 13 of the city of Tyre. And in verse 15 through 18, God describes the mourning that the nations will do over Tyre. Verse 17 through 18 has the actual song of lament that the nations would sing. And why is all this? Verse 19, God will make Tyre like a desolate city and will drag them down not into the sea, but like those who go into the pit. The idea being that they were like those who would go into the grave. Even so, the end of verse 20, God will use the fall of Tyre to glorify God's own name. Chapter 27. In chapter 27, God commands Ezekiel to sing a lamentation over the city of Tyre. The idea is not just that Ezekiel will be brokenhearted for the coming destruction, but this is how absolutely certain the fall of Tyre is. The final fall of Tyre will not happen for over 200 years. And he tells Ezekiel, it is so sure that they're going to fall, I want you to start singing the song now. The reason for the fall of Tyre is encapsulated at the end of verse 3. Yes, we saw how they rejoiced over the fall of Jerusalem, but the heart of that reaction is the pride in verse 3. And look at how Tyre describes itself. I am perfect in beauty. Now, we'll see this in the next chapter as well, but see how it said it right here. This is how she saw herself. In verse 4 through 9, God describes the beauty of Tyre. And because the source of Tyre's pride was in her navy, he describes her as this beautiful boat made with the finest of woods. Her sails were made of the finest Egyptian cotton. Whatever the best was, that's what Tyre had. Verse 10 and 11 describes the military strength of the city-state. In verse 12 through 25, God lists the nations and the people who are her customers, her partners. And there's patterns there we're studying. I'll leave you to do that on your own. In verse 26 through 28, God describes the fall of Tyre in sea terms. The prideful naval power from verse 3 through 9 is consumed where? In the midst of the sea. And verse 26 tells us that it was her rowers who brought her to the place where she would sink. Why? Because she's a sea power. And that thing that you thought made you strong is what is going to lead you to destruction. That's what brought you into the great waters where you would sink and be destroyed. Verse 29 through 32, other sailors will watch her and mourn over her fall. Verse 33, when she was on top, she made other people rich, but now she has been broken by the sea. All the people who used to love her will be appalled at her. He goes, they will hiss at you, Tyre, verse 36, and they will reject you, and you will cease to be. Chapter 28. Chapter 28 is the last chapter of this 3-chapter arc over Tyre. And what we have seen is the Lord declaring a judgment over the city, a judgment over the people, and now in this final chapter, we have a lament over the leader, the ruler, the prince of Tyre. If you have a New American Standard, it says the leader, and if you have a New King James or ESV, then your Bible says prince in verse 2. And the reason that it's translated as either leader or prince and not king is to set this individual apart from the king who's mentioned in verse 12. In verse 12, there's a king, but in the beginning of the chapter, there's a ruler. Now, here's what's going on. In verse 1 through 10, God tells Ezekiel about the coming judgment upon the prideful earthly leader of the city-state of Tyre. But in verses 12 through 19, God tells Ezekiel to sing a lament for the king of Tyre, and then proceeds to describe someone who could not possibly be any living man. In order to understand what's happening here, we need to understand what Paul teaches us in Ephesians 6:12. Ephesians 6:12. That for Christians, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, the powers, the forces of the darkness of this age, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. That the flesh and blood in front of us is not the true enemy, but there's an enemy behind the opponent who's in front of us. That person's not the enemy, they're lost. There's a difference. But behind them, there is a spiritual entity, a demonic force that seeks to steal, to kill, and to destroy. We will see this behind-the-scenes struggle vividly demonstrated in Daniel chapter 10. In Daniel chapter 10, Daniel is praying and he is mourning over the condition of his people. And he is doing this for 3 weeks. For 21 straight days, he is just fasting before the Lord, mourning before the Lord, weeping before the Lord. And on that 21st day, suddenly there's a vision of an angel standing in front of him. Daniel is overflowed by the sight of the angel, but the angel tells Daniel, do not be afraid, because the moment you started praying, God sent me to come and comfort you. But that was 21 days ago. So where have you been? Why did it take so long for this angel to show up? In Daniel 10:13 tells us why. I was sent on day 1, but the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me for 21 straight days. I wanted to come to you on the first day, but this entity over this kingdom did not let me do what I was sent to do. Now, there's a couple of things inside of that moment in Daniel that he's sharing with us. One, there is a spiritual battle that we cannot see, but is very, very real. Your inability to see it does not make it go away. We understand this when we get to the book of Hebrews. What is faith? It is believing in the things that you don't see. If you have to see them in order to believe them, it's not faith. There is no reward for, if you prove it to me, then I'll believe. Isn't that what Jesus told Thomas? But if you believe in what you cannot see because you know it to be true, because God says it to be true, then that's faith. And the same thing is there for the very real spiritual battle behind the scenes. But the second thing is this. When you pray, God's desire is to comfort you immediately. At the moment that you pray, He is getting things going. He is dispatching ministering angels to come and comfort us. But there is an opposing force that does not want that comfort to reach us. It's not equal to God. It's not the opposite of God. God has no opposite. There's nothing like Him. But that opposing force still does not want His comfort to reach us. And it's not some earthly human prince of Persia that stopped this angel. This angel could have run right past the guy. Any human king was no match for the angel sent to Daniel. But there was a spiritual entity whose domain was the entire kingdom of Persia. This entity was strong enough to delay this angel for 3 weeks, and the only reason that this angel could finally get past is because the archangel Michael came to help this angel out. And again, we'll see this in Daniel chapter 10. But this begs an obvious question for us. If God is sovereign, if he is all-powerful, then how can any demonic, satanic, opposing force delay his comfort to us? And the answer is simple. Sin. That's what allows it. That's what allows it to be delayed. And not just our individual real-time sin. I'm not saying, well, because you messed this up, that's why God's comfort can't come to you. That's certainly part of it. But think of it on a grander scale. Think of it as the sin that came into the world at the Garden of Eden. The sin that caused a perfect world to become a fallen world. Because at that moment that Adam sinned, he gave Satan the land deed of this earth. It was given to Adam. He was meant to be the one who was going to be in charge and tend to keep everything. But at the moment that he sinned, he handed that deed over to Satan and said, now you're in control. Now you're in charge. And our sin since that time has only declared that we agree, we confirm the decision that Adam already made. And now Satan is called the prince of the power of the air. And between the third heaven and the throne of grace and this earth where we are, he gets to control that realm. He gets to slow down anything that's coming through. He is allowed by our sin to rule and have tremendous influence and authority in this world at this time. Jesus himself acknowledges this. He calls Satan the ruler of this world, John 12, John 14. And Paul calls him the God of this age, 2 Corinthians 4:4. Now that doesn't sound great. But do not be deceived. Satan may have tremendous power and tremendous influence over this world at this time, but having the deed to the earth doesn't mean he gets to do whatever he wants. Now, here's what I mean. Let's say you own a piece of land free and clear. No lien, no mortgage. No one can tell you what to do with this land. It's all paid off. You have the deed in your hands, yet despite that legal ownership, you can't do whatever you want on that land. I mean, you can do a lot, but you couldn't do anything you wanted to do. You couldn't secede from the United States. You couldn't commit crimes on your property even though you own it free and clear. Why? Because your land and your ownership is subject to a higher power than you. And there is someone who dictates rules over that you still have to bow the knee to. The earth does not belong to the devil. He may have incredible influence right now, but Psalm 24:1, the earth is the Lord's and all it contains. And every piece of creation that exists on it, the world and those who dwell in it, belong to the King. This is what concerns me about those who are very concerned, almost to the point of maybe obsession about the spiritual plane, who feel the need to free a person of this spirit, of this or that spirit of that. Does the Lord Jesus grant his disciples the authority to cast out demons? The gospel says he does. We see a specific moment where he looks at it and he goes, I give you the ability to do this. But in Luke chapter 10, the 70 disciples return to the Lord after their mission trip, and they're doing it with joy. And they're saying, Lord, even the demons are subject to us in your name. They give all the glory to God. They understood what was going on in that dynamic. And when they say this, he says this. He goes, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. Meaning our authority over the demonic is the extension of the power of God over Satan when Satan originally fell. The only reason you have authority is because of my authority. I saw him cast down. Everything you do is under the shadow of that. Then Jesus continues and he tells the 70 disciples, but don't rejoice in this. Do not rejoice that the spirits are subject to you. Rejoice that your names are recorded in heaven. Here's the point. Don't get lost in the power and authority that may have been entrusted to you. Rejoice that you have eternal life with me. Here comes the huge danger to those who become obsessed by the supernatural, not aware of the supernatural. As Christians, we all need to understand there's a battle behind the things that we see. But for those who are obsessed with the supernatural, an everyday life with Jesus is not enough. That's the danger. They need more. They need more excitement and more meaning and more action and more results. And a humble life with the Lord does not satisfy. But that is contrary to the heart of Jesus. Again, Luke chapter 10. Don't get excited that the enemy flees from you. Colossians 3:2, set your mind on things above. Rejoice that your names are written in the Lamb's book of life. Now, fun fact, the fall of Satan that's mentioned in Luke chapter 10 is what we study here in this chapter of Ezekiel in verses 14 through 16. It's called the fall from the glorified or the glory to the profane. As we mentioned in the first 10 or so verses, God tells Ezekiel about the ruler of Tyre, the prince of Tyre, who said in his heart, verse 2, what did he say about himself? I am a god. All right, so already we're sounding real familiar, right? Real similar to the words of Lucifer that we studied in the book of Isaiah. In verse 3 through 4, we're told that this king was incredibly wise. No secret was a match for him, and he used his wisdom to make himself very wealthy and very powerful. And that abundance is what led him to be puffed up with pride. It's the same thing Paul tells us. Knowledge puffs up, love edifies. Being that wise, being able to solve every problem in front of you, tends to puff you up. Now, because of the description in verse 11 through 19 can only apply to Satan, as Satan was in the Garden of Eden, verse 13. And because Satan will be referred to as the king of Tyre in verse 12, what we may have in this verse 10 verses that is talking about a human ruler is a bit of crossover, a bit of blending. What it may point to, big may, this is Anthony thinking here, what may be going on is that the ruler of Tyre has allowed himself to be possessed by Satan, just like we see with Judas in the Gospels. It may be that Satan has used his wisdom through this human ruler in order to expand the power of Tyre and attempt to ruin the economy of Israel, as we discussed in chapter 26. And we're going to see references to the wisdom of Satan in verse 12 and 17. But what did we study in Genesis 3:1? And the serpent was in the garden and was more shrewd than any other creature in creation. So it shouldn't surprise us that wisdom is going to define Satan here. If the ruler of Tyre is possessed, if, that does not mean he's innocent of what happens. The ruler himself is puffed up with pride. He said, I am a god, even though he knew he was a man. Sin allows the enemy an opening to enter into the life of the lost. If the ruler is possessed, then his prideful heart is likely the opening that allowed Satan to enter in. Understand, I say in no uncertain terms, it is impossible for a Christian, for someone filled with the Spirit of God, to ever be possessed by devil or demon. Matthew 12, Mark 3. Matthew 12, Mark 3. You cannot go into someone's house and steal what they've got unless you tie the strong man up. And nobody is stronger than our God. But a Christian can be oppressed. That oppression can happen because of our sin. Or like Job, it can happen because of the plan and the permission of God. But if God does not dwell within you, if you have rejected His Spirit, then it is possible that some sin, especially dabbling with the occult in any possible form, Ouija boards, tarot cards, whatever it might be, your astrological sign and whatever it is that it means for you today, all of those are dabbling with the occult, and they can invite the enemy into your life. Regardless, because the ruler of Tyre allowed himself to be puffed up with pride, verse 6, God will bring the most ruthless of nations down upon Tyre, and that's verse 7. God asked the ruler of Tyre in verse 9, even when judgment comes, will you continue to say that you're a God? When your judgment, when your punishment is at your front door? Not at all. Verse 10, you will die the death of the uncircumcised, because the one true God said it would be so. In verse 11, God tells Ezekiel to take up a lamentation over the king of Tyre. And right from the beginning, we know something's different about this description. In verse 12, this being, this creation, had the seal of perfection, was full of wisdom, and perfect in beauty. No, that's weird enough. But then we read verse 13, and God tells this king of Tyre, you are in Eden, and then he makes sure we understand the very garden of God. And besides God, there was Adam, and there was Eve, and there was the serpent. Adam and Eve are long since gone. And God is the one who's talking, so the process of elimination tells us that much like there was a prince over Persia, Satan has established himself at this time to be the one over Tyre, to present himself as the direct competitor to Israel. In this moment, God pulls the costume off of the devil and shows us who this really is, who's really calling the shots. In verse 13, we're told that Satan, when he was still Lucifer, at the time of his creation, he was covered in every beautiful jewel. Near the end of verse 13, your Bible may say something about settings, or maybe something about timbrels with a small tambourine. The reason for the different translations is because both are valid meanings for the Hebrew word that's used here. The idea is something that's flat on one side and hollow on the other side. So for jewelry, it's where you would put the jewel. You would put it inside of this setting. But it also describes that tambourine that's hollow on one side and flat on the other side. But because some translations have looked at this and said we see more of the musical instrument inside of this Hebrew word, it has led to the theory that maybe, just maybe, we do not know for sure, but maybe Lucifer was the worship leader of heaven before the fall. Now that's speculation. This is our only hint that that might be true. But what we do know for absolutely sure is what we see in verse 14. He was the anointed cherub who covers. He was specially chosen by God and given the ability to cover. And we go, cover what? It's to cover the throne. It's the same thing that we see with the mercy seat when Moses was given the pattern, the picture for the ark. That on the top was the mercy seat, and on either side you had these two angels, and their wings did what? They covered the top of the mercy seat. And God would meet with Moses between the cherubim. This is a picture of the throne of God. Remember what we studied at the beginning of the book of Ezekiel. What is the job of the cherub? It's to protect the holy from becoming profane. It was Lucifer's honor to cover the throne of God, just like those cherubim that covered the mercy seat of the ark. He didn't get there because he earned the position. God himself placed Lucifer there. He was allowed to be on the holy mountain of God. He was blameless from the day of his creation. That's verse 15. And that means you weren't created with sin inside of you. You were created perfect. You had the seal of perfection. You chose sin. You chose to rebel against God. And just like the ruler of Tyre, the abundance of his trade, so all the blessings that God gave to him, led him to be prideful. That pride led to violence. So the revolt of Revelation 12:4. And because of this violence, Satan was cast down as profane. He was kicked out of the mountain of God. But it doesn't mean he can't go back. We see that in Job 1:6, when the sons of God have to go and give an accounting of themselves before the Lord. They go up to heaven, they appear before the throne. He is still allowed to go into the throne room of heaven. He won't be kicked out permanently until later on. We'll study that in the book of Revelation. But now when he goes to heaven, he comes as a stranger, as an opponent, as an outsider, because the covering cherub has been destroyed. Verse 17 confirms that Satan's heart was lifted up because of his beauty. He started out full of wisdom. Now his wisdom has been corrupted. He will be cast down, and the kings of the earth will look down upon him. And this is similar to the action we see in Isaiah 14:16. Isaiah 14:16, when we're told that the great opponent is going to be cast down, and all the kings of the earth will look at him and go, is this the guy? Is this the one who caused all the problems like this? In verses 20 through 24, God proclaims a judgment against Sidon. Now, this seems to come out of nowhere, unless you know your history and you have a good map. Tyre and Sidon were sister cities and right next to each other. All the way through like the Assyrian Empire, Sidon was actually the bigger sister. She was the tougher one. It was later on that Tyre surpassed her. But because they were so close together, their people groups were very strongly related. Where one went, the other went. So if Tyre was this opponent to Israel, then so was Sidon as well. Verse 24 tells us that Sidon was like a painful thorn to the house of Israel. And because there were this agitation and this pain to Israel, Sidon would be judged as well. But contrasted to both of them, to Tyre and Sidon, God is going to gather the house of Israel back together one day. Remember how this entire 3-chapter arc began in chapter 26. Tyre mocking Jerusalem, rejoicing at their fall. But at the end of this chapter here, God shows that their mocking was pointless. Because one day Israel would dwell securely, but Tyre would be no more. Chapter 29. In chapter 29 through 32, we have this hefty section of prophecy against Egypt. Now, verse 1, actually, God backs up a year into the 10th year of the exile. Remember, before we were in the 11th year. Now he backs up a year, and he gives us the 10th year. So this chapter is before chapter 26, which means this chapter departs the chronological nature of the rest of the book of Ezekiel. Remember, this is one of the things that sets this book apart. All the other books are kind of like, all right, let me go by themes. I'm going to jump all over the calendar, and we're like, what's going on? But it made sense to the Eastern mind. Ezekiel's different. Ezekiel's different because it's more chronological. This happened in this year, and then a couple years later, then this happened. But this chapter breaks that pattern. It backs up a year, and the reason it does is that Ezekiel is putting all the Egypt section together. But it also shows something else. It shows us that the Lord has been warning both Egypt and Israel for years of Egypt's inability to fight off the Babylonian threat. In verse 2, Ezekiel is called to speak against Pharaoh and against Egypt. In verse 2, God describes Egypt as this large, hulking river monster. We're going to see this again in Ezekiel chapter 32. This description has kind of a crocodile/hippo kind of feel to it. The idea is that the river monster feels strong when it's in the water. And other people look at it in the water, and they feel like it's strong too. And that's why at the end of verse 4, all the fish cling to its scales. They're holding on for a free ride, for a free lunch. And this strength, this perceived strength, verse 3, is what led to its pride. And the issue is always pride. Egypt said to itself, the Nile is mine. I'm the one who has made this. And because Egypt became puffed up, God will put hooks in the jaw of the river monster, verse 4, and he will drag it out of the water, and he will leave it to die in the wilderness. The river monster is strong in the water, right? It is useless on dry land. It is useless in the desert. And what happened to all those people who were clinging on to the scales of Egypt? Verse 4 and 5, they go too. Everything that's been holding on to Egypt is going to be dragged away. And they will be left in the open field where their bodies will be food for the beasts. When the people of Egypt see this, they will know that God is the Lord. In the last part of verse 6, God uses the same imagery as the envoy of Assyria in 2 Kings 16. 2 Kings 16. If you remember back in 2 Kings 16, the Assyrians have surrounded Jerusalem. King Hezekiah is the king. And he's telling them, don't trust that Egypt's going to save you. Don't resist my king because you think Egypt can come and set you free. He goes, Egypt is going to be like a staff made of dried out reeds that when you put your weight on it, it's going to crack and the shards are going to go into your hand. Here we see God says that's exactly what happens. In verse 7, how when Israel leaned upon them, Egypt snapped and tore Israel's hand apart. And you're like, well, they did the best they could. Why are they being punished for this? Because Egypt presented themselves as his strength who could do it. As this behemoth who could fend off the Babylonians. Even though God told them some 16 years prior in Jeremiah 25, that this cup of judgment is coming from you, so drink it. Do not resist Babylon. It is my judgment upon this world. But because they rejected the warning of God in Jeremiah chapter 25, God would bring upon Egypt a sword that would cut them off. He would turn them into a place of desolation, and they would stay that way for 40 years. At the end of 40 years, verse 13, God will gather them back to their land. That's why there's an Egypt on the map now. But they will never again be the mighty kingdom they once were. At one point, they were the world-ruling empire, but not anymore. Verse 15, from now on, they will be the lowest of kingdoms. Why? Because of verse 16. God wants to make sure that anytime Israel looks at Egypt now, they will never again be tempted to think they can be our strength. They can be our help. In verse 17 through 21, Ezekiel skips ahead and includes a prophecy that will come 17 years later. This will coincide with the fall of Egypt after the campaign of Babylon against Tyre in Ezekiel chapter 26. Remember in 26, we discussed how Nebuchadnezzar fought against Tyre for over a decade, but when he was done, he didn't have anything to show for it. Because ancient armies primarily worked for plunder. If there is no plunder, then there is no pay. That's what verse 18 says here. That Nebuchadnezzar made his army work hard against Tyre, but they had no wages for their hard work. Therefore, God was going to give Egypt into the hands of the Babylonian army, and the riches of Egypt would be the wages for the Babylonian soldiers. On the same day that Egypt fell, verse 21, God was still at work, and he's starting to raise up a new leader or authority in Israel. We don't know who that is, but God said it, so it must be true. Chapter 30. In chapter 30, in verse 5, God reveals to Ezekiel a defensive league has formed around Egypt. So when Egypt fell, the league will fall too. Therefore, Ezekiel is commanded to wail for the nations that will fall at that time. In verse 10, God repeats he will use Nebuchadnezzar to accomplish this. And in verse 11, God again describes Babylon as the most ruthless of nations, or the most terrible of nations, depending on your translation. It's a repeat of Ezekiel 28:7. In verse 12, God tells Egypt that God will make the canals that run off the Nile go dry. What did Egypt say about itself in the previous chapter? The Nile is mine. I'm the one who made it. He goes, you can't even stop me from making it go dry once it's wet. So what God is doing is he is attacking the perceived strength of Egypt. In verse 13 through 19, God describes how he's going to sweep through this whole list of cities. He's going to clear them of their idols. They will know that God is the Lord because he has done this. In verse 20, we are in the first month of the 11th year of the exile. Jerusalem's going to fall in 3 months. So this is 3 months before the final fall of Jerusalem. What God tells Egypt in verse 20 through 26 is that the same God who's against Israel is against Egypt too. As they're watching and receiving news of the fall of Jerusalem, God's saying, I'm going to do this to you too. The God that has broken the strength of Egypt is the one who has made the army of Babylon strong. That's verse 24. Chapter 31. In verse 1, we find ourselves 2 months later from the end of chapter 30. The end of chapter 30 was the 11th year, first month. Now we're 2 months later. We're 1 month before the fall of Jerusalem. And God is going to warn Egypt one last time. Because in Egypt's mind, even though they've been defeated on the battlefield by Babylon, they still think they can pull this off. Maybe they're not strong enough to kick Babylon out of the area. They're not strong enough to come and rescue Jerusalem or anyone else. But maybe they could still hold on to what was there. In verse 2, God asked Pharaoh, who do you see yourself out there on the world stage? When you see all these players, who do you go, hey, we're kind of like them, they're kind of like us. He goes, how about you consider Assyria? Verse 3. At one time, they were the world ruling empire, just like Egypt was. And in verse 3 through 9, Assyria is presented like this giant cedar tree. Its top grew up into the clouds. Verse 6 tells us that the nations gathered under it. It sought its shade. The idea was that when Assyria was on top, all the other nations kind of cozied up to it. Oh, let's get close to you. Let's come alongside you. Be nice to us. Verse 9 tells us the secret of Assyria's greatness. I made them great. I made it beautiful with the multitude of its branches. But verse 10, Assyria let their greatness go to their heads, just like Lucifer, just like Tyre. The sin is always pride. Therefore, verse 11, Assyria was handed over to the ruler of nations, which is Babylon. They cut Assyria down, verse 12. And all the other nations who used to hide in its shade, where are they now? They've abandoned her. They've left her all alone. Verse 14 tells us that tall trees should not be proud of their high stature, because you didn't make yourself that way. If they are proud, God will cut them down and send them to the pit. Verse 15 through 17, God describes how he toppled Assyria. He sent them down to Sheol. He sent them down to the underworld. Then God gives the grand question to Egypt. Which of these trees are your equal? If even the tallest tree, Assyria, was cut down, what makes you think you can resist me? Chapter 32. In chapter 32, we are in the year after the fall of Jerusalem. We have gone from the year before to the year after. And God commands Ezekiel to take up a lamentation over Pharaoh. The lamentation is verse 2 through 15. Verse 16 will act as the statement that goes, what you just read was the lamentation. This lamentation starts off with God revealing how Pharaoh saw himself. We see a lot of this in Tyre and with Egypt as well. But here Pharaoh saw himself as this young, hungry, slick lion. But God's description of Egypt in chapter 29 is the correct one. You're like this big, plodding sea monster. You muddy the water. You contaminate the river when you move. You thought you were this slick, fast, agile hunter. That's not what you are. Continuing in this sea monster motif in verse 3, God describes how he's going to cast a net over Egypt, cast a net over the sea monster, drag it on the land, and then when it's weak and it's powerless, the beasts of the field and the birds of the air will devour it. Please note that God will strongly present himself as the one who's doing this in this first lamentation. In verse 3 through 15, God says 15 times in the New American Standard, 14 times in the New King James, I will. I will do this. I will do that. That's not even counting the other times when he says, I make and I strike. I mean, just the I wills alone are all over these verses. God is not apologetic about what he is doing. But he is also not punitive or vindictive. As we will see in chapter 33, God's heart is always for the wicked to repent. So what God is doing here is what he did in the 10 plagues on Egypt when he was judging them. He was judging them in order to bring them into obedience. This is why verse 7 and 8 invokes the imagery of the 9th plague upon Egypt. Exodus chapter 10. Exodus chapter 10. The 9th plague was what? God caused darkness to fall upon Egypt. And that's what's happening here in verse 7 and 8. What God is not doing is telling the sun and the stars to stop shining. That's not what's happening. What he does is he covers Egypt with darkness so they can't see the sun and the stars. And that's the end of verse 8. God will set darkness over them. The idea is like a blanket, like a cover. In verse 9 and 10, God will trouble the heart of the nations who see what is happening to Egypt. In verse 11 and 12, God will use Babylon to do this. Verse 13 through 15, the final result of all of this is that the waters of Egypt will finally calm down. Remember how this started in verse 2. Egypt muddies the waters when it moves. But when Egypt is removed and made a desolation, the waters will finally be calm. Now, verse 16 tells us that those verses we just read are the lamentations that the daughters of nations will sing over Egypt when it falls. That's lamentation number 1 of the chapter. About 2 weeks later, verse 17, 14 days later, the word of the Lord comes again to Ezekiel. And God tells Ezekiel in verse 18, I want you to cry out. I want you to wail for the hordes of Egypt. I want you to weep for those who will die and go down to the pit. Remember, we're still some like 15 years in the future, at least 15 years, before Egypt actually falls. But God will use Babylon to judge all the enemies of Israel, not just Egypt. And that's the idea of the uncircumcised we see here in verse 19, but we're going to see it in so many places in this section we're going into now. When you see these references to the uncircumcised, it's a reference to those who do not enjoy a covenant relationship with God. That's the idea. In verse 21, God tells Egypt that the mighty warriors of other nations who have already been destroyed are anticipating the coming destruction of Egypt. That they're in Sheol already, and they're like, Egypt's coming too, right? In verse 22 through 23, we see Assyria is already there. They fell before Egypt did. In verse 24 through 25, there's Elam. That's a smaller nation to the southeast of Babylon. Verse 26 through 28, we have Meshach and Tubal. They're in modern-day Turkey. Verse 29, Edom is mentioned. We'll see them again in chapter 35. In verse 30, we have other chiefs of the north, just other people too. And then also the Sidonians, the sister city of Tyre. They're there as well. In verse 3, God tells Pharaoh that these are the nations that Egypt will see in the afterlife. They will see in Sheol. That even though Egypt was scary to other nations, verse 32, they will be made to lie down with those who have been slain by the sword, and this will happen because this is what the Lord has declared. Father, we love you.